fascinating orator. Now, one of his major scholarly vocations involves representing Bangladeshi writers to the world. Today's talk is no exception. He's going to talk on Kazi Nazrul, world literature, and internationalism. So without much ado, let us give a big round of applause for
Thanks, Shamsad, for the glowing introduction. After such a glowing introduction, it's always a challenge in terms of saying things, but I'll try, and thank you all for being here. First, a quick comment on the language I'm using, English. Why English? Why do you have to talk about a Bengali poet in English here in Dhaka? It's heartening that some of my comrades from the United States and Europe and Latin America want to explore the work of Kazi Nazrul. In fact, my lecture, as Shamsad has already pointed out, is co-sponsored by the Global Center for Advanced Studies based in New York and in Santiago, Chile, and in Dublin, Ireland. I've been asked by this organization's director, Professor Preston C. Davis, to share with you a few words about this organization, about the Global Center for Advanced Studies, known as GCAS, for which I myself have been working as its vice president since its inception. Founded in 2013, GCAS is a radical research institute and a graduate school fully independent from the corporate dictates pervasive in academia today. This allows us to teach in a critical manner without coercive pressures and to thus resist being forced into the outrageously corporatized model of education prevalent today. In fact, it is our quest to create a transformative institution of higher learning, higher education. In doing this, we want to create a community of scholars, farmers, workers, and students who can add to our conversation, a conversation that is itself an act in the belief of the humanities, philosophy, literature, art, science, architecture, religious studies, and poetry. We want to create an education that is inclusive, democratic, and committed to justice for the oppressed. Of course, there are great challenges that accompany our risk-taking, but we are willing to take this chance for the sake of philosophy and poetry, for the sake of the humanities, or for the sake of change above all. Its core and affiliate faculty today is composed of over 100 academics, artists, and activists from around the world, some of whom are known for their extraordinary, groundbreaking works in the fields of theory, philosophy, literature, political economy, and so on. So much for GCAS. Now on to my topic. Kazi Nazrul, world literature within quote marks and internationalism. I think I would do well to tell you right away that I will not only range within, but also range beyond the topic in question in order to point out some, if not all, relatively explored areas of Nazrul's work that I find politically significant at this turbulent historical conjuncture, and that my purpose here is by no means to offer a comprehensive evaluation of Nazrul's work, or for that matter, an evaluation of the entire range and richness and rigor of Nazrul's works, staggering as they are. I think it's not even possible in a lecture like this one, to be honest. Also, owing to time constraints, I have to leave out quite a cluster of interconnected textual analysis but I hope the points I intend to make would come out one way or another in at least some broad strokes. In fact, what you are going to hear this afternoon is only a tiny segment of my work in progress on Nazrul. In any event, I have 3 epigraphs to my lecture. The first epigraph is Nazrul's own statement about world literature, and I quote Nazrul in my own translation, quote, "The work that does not find a place in world literature cannot be a permanent literary work. It dies out quickly after momentary acceptance and admiration, so it is important that we forge a universalism in our literature without, of course, ignoring or denying our own characteristics," unquote. The second epigraph is another statement made by Nazrul himself. Again, I quote him in my translation. I quote, I've been born at a conjuncture of the possibilities of the impossible in the 20th century. Although I have been born in this country, in this society, I do not belong to them only, but I also belong to all societies, all countries," unquote. Now mark this expression, this turn of expression, the possibilities of the impossible. This is reminiscent, indeed, very clearly, of a statement that Che Guevara once made, very instructively, interestingly. Che said, we are realists. We are realists because we dream the impossible. And also reminiscent of my favorite African-American writer, novelist, James Baldwin, who put it this way, I quote, "The least that we can demand is the impossible," unquote. Now the third epigraph is again another statement, a statement made by Nazrul that I think underlines Nazrul's anti-coal mining, international, ecological concern, so to speak. Back in the year 1920, I quote Nazrul in my translation, quote, "People are busy extracting coal from the ground and seeking help therefrom. But what coal burning entails contributes to the decline in atmospheric oxygen levels. According to an English scientist, our air is being increasingly polluted, and I fear we are not distant from the age of the carbonic assaults," unquote. The epigraphs being stated, let me move on to the second stream of my lecture. I should point out here that there are several streams of my lecture. And those several streams deal with relatively separate but profoundly interconnected themes that I want to explore in Nazrul's work. So I have to bring up the question of paradoxes and ironies in history. Indeed, history bristles with paradoxes and ironies. And one such irony is that Kazi Nazrul is our, within quotation marks, national poet. For our own national ruling classes and their allies have long come to stand in for almost everything. Every system of oppression Nazrul himself continued to combat, confront, and challenge. Capitalism, colonialism, communalism, racism, and patriarchy, profoundly interconnected as they all are. I think it would be no overstatement to maintain that one politically significant way of rereading Nazrul today is to recall and reassert the 3 distinctly pronounced but yet to be realized principles of our own national liberation movement of 1971: equality, justice, and dignity. These principles, I argue, deeply inform a great deal of Nazrul's work. Nazrul's own line, I quote, "Of equality I sing," unquote, constitutes a leitmotif in a number of his poems. But Nazrul is more than a poet, a didactic poet of principles. We know this, of course, that Nazrul is one of the major Bengali poets, and I venture to add, he is one of the greatest revolutionary poets in the world, one who manifestly declares in Dhumketu, I quote, "I have come now for the great revolution," unquote. And Nazrul drew energy and inspiration in his own creative ways from the trinity of the revolutions of his time, the Turkish Revolution, the Irish Revolution, and of course, the Russian Revolution. I can help recalling two conversations surrounding Nazrul's work in places outside Bangladesh. In January last year, I met a group of black communists in Havana, Cuba. I shared with them Nazrul's poems that are both explosively political and intimately lyrical. Their immediate response registered their solidarity. Nazrul is our poet, a Cuban poet as well. I also had the chance to discuss with the great Kenyan writer-activist Ngugi wa Thiong'o in Pullman, Washington, back in 2005. Ngugi wondered if I was talking about a Kenyan poet. That Nazrul might sound like a Cuban poet and a Kenyan poet at the same time cannot be reduced to a matter of mere well-meaning solidarity or appropriation. Nazrul was not familiar with either Cuban or Kenyan poetry, but the fact that his lines resonate with other revolutionaries from the Third War instructively points to the very character and content of Nazrul's own work. Such work underlines his internationalism and universalism. In fact, within quotation marks, a universalism from below. To use the Caribbean Marxist C.L.R. James's phrase, Nazrul is the only major Bengali poet to have come from the rural proletariat, one who effortlessly relates to the oppressed of the war. In his poem, Kuli Mujur, Coolies and Laborers, just to take one example, Nazrul raises his usual question, how long will the oppressed be treated like this throughout the war? That was Nazrul's question. But Nazrul's universalism is no erasure of the particular. It is no erasure of the particular, it is the other way around. It accentuates, clarifies, extends, and accounts for the particular. Also, universalism itself is not exclusively the property of the European Enlightenment. It has long remained in indigenous, Islamic, and revolutionary traditions in different parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's not for nothing that the major Native American novelist Leslie Marmon Silko eagerly endorses Marx's articulation of a revolutionary universalism, in the tradition of which I argue Nazrul can surely be placed. To see this point, one only need to look at Nazrul's 1925 collection of poems tellingly titled Shammobadi, meaning the communist, not to mention his powerful and beautiful rendition of the communist anthem, the International in Bangla. But then Nazrul is first and foremost a poet. First and foremost a poet of his own people, peasants and workers, organically rooted in his own land. Nazrul offers words and works that are decisively forged in the fire of his people's struggles against oppression and injustice in colonial India. Now, let me move on to the third stream of my lecture now. Well, Nazrul takes poetry as a charged site of actions and interventions against different forms and forces of oppression and exploitation. As we would hopefully see, he takes poetry as an anti-colonial praxis, as an anti-colonial intervention, in particular given the determinate contradictions of the very historical moment that produced his work. Now I need to make some introductory observations about Nazrul, ones with which some of you might be overly familiar, but those observations are intended particularly, if not exclusively, for those who are yet to explore Nazrul's work. So, Nazrul's early stories with which he began his writing career at least partly attest to that anti-colonial praxis I spoke of, although his voice as a whole, or rather his voices in their totality, can by no means be characterized quickly and one-sidedly, simply given his phenomenal productivity and the diversity of his passions, practices, and styles. It is here that I need to call attention to the Bengali modernist poet critic Buddhadev Bosu's own evaluation of Nazrul. There is no doubt that Buddhadev Bosu exhibited a high voltage enthusiasm about Nazrul's poetry at a time when other established poets and critics remained relatively silent about him. Yet Buddhadev, characteristically remaining high on Eurocentric modernist aestheticism, utterly failed to account for the richness and variety as well as the anti-colonial character and content of Nazrul's literary productions and music. Indeed, Nazrul is not only a poet and a short story writer, certainly a poet in the first place, but also a musician, lyricist or song composer, novelist, playwright, even a theorist of world literature, filmmaker, editor, journalist, even a drummer and an actor. And of course, he was a revolutionary activist in his own right, one for whom the borderlines between poetry and politics continued to dissolve at the battlefronts of history. I think I would do well to mention here that Nazrul himself, along with his comrade, very close comrade, Muzaffar Ahmad, seriously contemplated building a revolutionary communist party in India. In fact, Nazrul himself ended up establishing a political party called Labour Swaraj Party. He in fact wrote the manifesto of that particular party at one point, signing his name there. Anyways, but Nazrul's productivity and the variety of his preoccupations spanned a relatively brief period of 24 years between the two world wars, from 1919 to 1942. And of those 24 years, only 24 years, Nazrul gave only 12 to poetry and later increasingly moved onto the world of music, inaugurating, one might argue, an excitingly experimental chapter in the global history of music itself. Over a period of 12 years then, Nazrul published a total of 15 collections of poems that include Ogni Bina, published in 1922, Dolon Chapa, published in 1923, Bisher Bashi, published in 1924, Bhagargan, again published in 1924, Chayanot in 1925, Chintanama, published in 1925, Shambhavadi, again published in 1925, Kuber Hawa in 1926, Sharvahara in 1926, Honi Mamusha in 1927, Shindu Hindol in 1927, Jinjir in 1928, Chakrabak in 1929, Shondha in 1929, and Pralay Shikha in 1930. The list itself is not only remarkable in terms of underlining Nazrul's output, but it also immediately reveals the exceptional rapidity with which Nazrul produced his works. Indeed, none of his contemporaries, that included a whole host of figures from, say, Azfar Hussain and Ghulam Mustafa and Krishna Dayal Bosu, through Jivanananda Das and Shurin Datto and Josimuddin, to Buddhadev Bosu and Vishnu De and Arun Mitra, could simply match up to Nazrul's productivity. Even Rabindranath, who was also writing with full force in the 1920s, could not produce as much as Nazrul did during that decade, a decade that quickly established Nazrul as nothing short of a phenomenon in Bangla poetry. It is also revealing that his own contemporary, Jivanananda Das, who was even slightly older than Nazrul, was initially influenced by none other than Nazrul himself. In fact, Jivanananda, a highly powerful poet as he is, was simply groping or seeking to find his voice in the world of poetry at a time when Nazrul already reached a remarkable height of poetic accomplishments while also coming to influence his own seniors. But Nazrul's productivity did not interfere with the quality of his poetry, as well as with the variety of thematic and stylistic trajectories he pursued in his work. Take the year 1922 alone as an example. It was in that year when Nazrul published his famous poem Bidrohi, the Rebel, a rhetorically and linguistically explosive poem, a politically charged anti-colonial poem that immediately established him as the rebel poet in Bangla literature. But I will argue that he's more than a rebel poet, he's a revolutionary. I'll come to that point a little later. Anyways, it was in the same year when Nazrul also wrote a number of poems, at least 18 other poems, great poems. One may mention at least such poems as Agamoni, Kamal Pasha, Anwar Pasha, Doduludul, Bandanagan, Pagol Pothik, Nishite Pritam, Dahant Mala, Badol Dire, Dil Daradi, and Fatya-i Doaz Dahan, among others. What is remarkable about Nazrul's achievements in 1922 alone was that Nazrul hardly repeated himself in his work. Rather, he exemplified and even celebrated the richness of his own variety. For instance, on the one hand, he gave us a poem like Bidrohi in 1922, a long poem with unprecedented rhythmic charge and velocity, accompanied by a chain of dynamic and even highly transformative signifiers that enact and interplay between the lyrical and the dramatic. On the other hand, in the same year, Nazrul produced a poem like Doduludul, experimenting with the Arabic meter called Motakara. More on his metrical experiments and adventures later, and I would argue that even in his metrical adventures, in his metrical experiments, Nazrul was articulating, at least at any rate indirectly, an anti-colonial position. I'll take up that particular issue later. But back to the year 1922. So, in 1922, Nazrul also wrote poems like Kamal Pasha and Anwar Pasha in response to certain contemporary events, making the Gramscian point, so to speak, that events are the real dialectics of history. Nazrul wrote a poem about Hazrat Muhammad in the same year, while at the same time, in yet another poem, he devoted his lines to the Hindu goddess Durga. Further, he offered us a series of love poems varying his mood from the euphoric to the melancholic, for instance. And the year in which all this was done, again, was 1922. In sum, throughout the 1920s, Kazi Nazrul exemplified productivity, variety, richness, and unprecedented stylistic and metrical innovations, the details of which cannot even be remotely recounted in a lecture like this. But I'll touch upon some of those issues again later. But Nazrul's enormous literary significance notwithstanding, Nazrul continues to remain ignored in contemporary studies of what is called world literature. And even in post-colonial literary criticism today, for that comparative literary criticism in our parts of the world has hardly done justice to Nazrul's poetic interventions, hell-bent as they are on blasting open the continuum of colonial history at the textual level at any rate, while remaining committed to the emancipation of humanity in its entirety. I pointed out elsewhere how the protocols of what is called comparative literature, ones that figures like Buddhadev Boshu and Shudin Dotto, as well as their acolytes have mobilized, have proven not only outrageously misleading, but also terribly Eurocentric. After all, comparison is no neutral thing. I'll be talking about the politics of comparison. Yet comparison is by no means a neutral thing. Comparison may mystify and even reinforce and reproduce unequal power relations among different subjects, sites, and scenes. For instance, it is still customary to compare Nazrul to Byron and Shelley and to even Rudyard Kipling. Come on. As Buddhadev Boshu so uncritically did, so as to be able to account for Nazrul's greatness, while of course making the point that the West is the measure of all things literary and artistic. And I'm not again making connections. I'm not again against comparing. I myself do what is called comparative literature. But I think the question that we need to raise here, what kind of comparison? What does that comparison do? How does that comparison enable, actually, let's say, cultural struggles against different systems and structures of our relations and production relations? I think that, for me, as a comparatist, politically significant question, and kept raising this question vis-a-vis Buddhadev Boshu and Shudin Dotto and their acolytes. And But if one has to make connections between Nazrul and other poets, no. A poet is not a solitary figure in the final instance. One might begin by placing Nazrul in the company of his own predecessors, such as Nanak and Chandidash and Lalun on the one hand, and on the other in the company of such revolutionary poets from Asia, Africa and Latin America, such poets as Nazim Hikmet from Turkey, Pablo Neruda from Chile, Amy Césaire from Martinique, Julia de Burgos from Puerto Rico, Faiz Ahmed Faiz from Pakistan, Roque Dalton from El Salvador, Odo Rene Castillo from Guatemala, Kim Chi-ha from Korea, Mahmoud Darwish from Palestine, Jose Maria Sison from the Philippines, to name but a few. It is interesting and even instructive that the leading French philosopher and the leading philosopher of our times, Alain Badiou, maps out a global revolutionary tradition of poetry in the age of the poets. In fact, this book called The Age of the Poets is in English translation, and this translation was done by Bruno Bastille. It came out in the year 2014. I'm quoting Alain Badiou. Can't help saying that Alain Badiou was at one point president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and a good comrade. So I'm quoting my own comrade. Let's see. In a comradely fashion. How far can I be comradely? As yet to be seen. In the last century, I quote Badiou, in the last century, some truly great poets in almost all languages on earth have been communists. In an explicit or formal way, for example, the following poets were committed to communism: Nazim Hikmet in Chile, so you mentioned Nazim Hikmet, Pablo Neruda in Spain, Rafael Alberti in Italy, Eduardo Sanguinetti in Greece, Yanis Rhizomes in China, I. King in Palestine, Mahmoud Darwish in Peru, Cesar Vallo, and in Germany, the shining example is above all Bertolt Brecht. But we could cite a very large number of other names in other languages throughout the world, unquote. One can surely place Nazrul in the constellation of the poets Badiou lists here. And Badiou does an interesting thing. Badiou makes connections between poetry as such and what is called communism. And I can resist quoting Badiou here at some length, bear with me, because this is very relevant to my own understanding of Kazi Nazrul. So Badiou raises this question: can we understand this link between poetic commitment and communist commitment as a simple illusion, an error or an errancy, an ignorance of the ferocity of states ruled by communist parties? I do not believe so. Because I do not believe so, I wish to argue, on the contrary, that there exists an essential link between poetry and communism. If we understand communism closely in its primary sense, the concern for what is common to all. The concern for what is common to all, a tense, paradoxical, violent law of life in common. The desire that what ought to be common and accessible to all should not be appropriated by the servants of capital. The poetic desire that the things of life would be like the sky and the earth, like the water of the oceans and the brushes on a summer night, that is to say, would belong by right to the whole world. Poets are communist for a primary reason, which is absolutely essential, because their domain is language, most often their native language. Unquote. That's what I totally agree with. And I would also say that this could very well be Nazrul Islam's own statement, because some of the statements that Nazrul Islam makes actually in Bartaman Vishwa Sahitya, which is an essay Nazrul wrote on world literature, resonate. Some of the things he says there resonate with Badiou's words here. Or I would put it this way: Badiou's words also resonate with some of the things Nazrul says in his essay Bartaman Vishwa Sahitya. Indeed. In other words, Nazrul anticipates Badiou. Is there too much to say? I don't know. What do you think, Shamsad? Well, there are correspondences, there are similarities which you can explore, and I'm very interested in exploring correspondences and similarities, not just for the sake of exploring, correspondences and similarities. There are other reasons. I like this two-word dictum that has come from none other than the great, as they say, the great modernist novelist E.M. Forster. Only connect. Well, making connections is important, but so what? Making connections for what? That's the question. You make connections in order to keep the system intact, or do you make connections in an attempt to forge solidarity against the systems of oppression that characterize the daily practice of our living in the world today? So that's the question. Anyways, I need to get back to my stream, a little away from it. So, Nazrul even anticipates some crucial insights mobilized by some of the poet's value lists. As I have argued elsewhere, I cannot go into the details here, but here I cannot help calling attention to some lines from Nazrul's decisively internationalist poem called Kuli Mojur, as well as to the lines from Bedor Brecht's poem called Questions from a Worker Who Reads. First, Nazrul in Bangla. Rajpothe tabo choliche motor, সাগর জাহাজ চলে, রেলপথে চলে বাষ্প শকট, দেশ ছেয়ে গেল কলে। বলো তো এসব কাহাদের দান, তোমার অট্টালিকা কার খুনে রঙা? ছুরি খুলে দেখো, প্রতি ইটে আছে লেখা, তুমি জানো না তো, কিন্তু পথের প্রতি ধূলিকণা জানে, ওই পথ, ওই জাহাজ, শকট, অট্টালিকার মানে। That is Nazrul, and now Brecht. Who built thieves of the seven gates? In the books you will read the names of kings. Did the kings haul up the lumps of rock and Babylon many times demolished? Who raised it up so many times? In what houses of gold glittering Lima did its builders live? Where the evening that the great wall of China was finished did the masons go? Great Rome is full of triumphal arches. Who erected them? Who? So many reports, so many questions. That was Bertolt Brecht. So far as I know, Nazrul didn't read Brecht. He was somewhat older than Nazrul, and there was no question of Brecht reading Nazrul either. But true, Nazrul's poem Kuli Mojur was written earlier than Brecht's poem, Questions from a Worker Who Reads. And true, one can surely make connections between Nazrul and Brecht, their different stylistic signatures notwithstanding. I think comparison here, by making connections, but also zeroing in on historical specificities, may serve as a means to forging the kind of anti-colonial and insurrectionary solidarity Nazrul's own revolutionary internationalism ardently accentuates in the poem called Kuli Mojur, for instance. That being said, let me move on to stream 4 of my talk. True, I cannot even quickly traverse the entire range of Nazrul's oeuvre here to point out his revolutionary universalism, nor do I intend to rehearse well-known positions vis-à-vis his work, but I want to call attention to only a few significant tracks and trajectories in Nazrul's works that I think have received little or no attention in contemporary Nazrul criticism. For instance, first, Nazrul is one of those rare poets who could effortlessly translate some of the basic tenets of even Marxian critique of political economy into the idiom of poetry without losing aesthetic integrity. I should mention once again his poem Kuli Mojur, as well as his Krishaner Gan, among many others, as effective examples. In all this, Nazrul invites comparison with the Salvadoran poet Roque Dalton and the Puerto Rican feminist poet Julia de Burgos. In fact, Julia de Burgos is one of the greatest feminist poets in Latin America I have read, can help saying this. And she effortlessly mobilizes the tropes and terms of political economy in the space of the poem. without burdening the poem. She talks about how domestic labor gets unpaid, remains unpaid and is rendered invisible in a poem without burdening it, meaning that without losing this aesthetic integrity. You know, so effortlessly does it. And she's a Marxist feminist, and Marxist feminist critique of political economy is her subject in her poems. Another poet, another feminist poet from Latin America, Giovanna Bailey, she does the same. She uses words like, you know, relations of production, mode of production in poems, in her poems. Of course, Nazrul is no mechanical Marxist. But his deep veneration of Marx is explicitly spelled out in his largely unread essay on world literature that I mentioned earlier. Nazrul came to know at least the Communist Manifesto via his closest comrade, Muzaffar Ahmed. As you know, he was one of the founders of the Communist Party of India, and his Interdisciplinary Studies is one of the best intellectual and political biographies of Kazi Nazrul. He was one of the founders of the Communist Party of India, and he was Nazrul's close comrade. So Nazrul came to know the Communist Manifesto through him, and particularly via his good friend Shomendranath Thakur, grandnephew of Rabindranath Tagore, and the founder of the Revolutionary Communist Party of India, as well as the first translator of the Communist Manifesto itself in the subcontinent. I should point out here that Shomendranath Thakur was, in fact, treated as kind of black sheep in the Tagore family. Why? Because he was a communist. He wasn't treated very well in that elite Tagore family, except Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore liked him a lot, actually. In fact, when Shomendranath Thakur was translating the Communist Manifesto into Bengali, Shomendranath Thakur shared that draft with Rabindranath Tagore. And he read the Communist Manifesto because of, not because Rabindranath wanted to read the Communist Manifesto, but because Shomendranath Thakur made him read the Communist Manifesto. And he did. And it's very interesting that in an essay on education, rather the political education written in 1922, Rabindranath even rehearsed some of the ideas, reproduced some of the ideas from the Communist Manifesto. It might sound very outrageous. I've written an essay actually about that, Rabindranath and the Communist Manifesto. And so, just couldn't help saying that. So, and Nazrul, of course, was closely familiar with the Communist Manifesto, and his collection of poems called Sammyavadi, meaning the communist, serves as a compelling example of how he creatively internalized and mobilized some of the manifesto's ideas, while variously zeroing in on the question of what Marx himself calls universal human emancipation. I should point out here that Marxism is not just simply about class struggle. Of course, class struggle is a very central category in Marxism, but if you take Marxism as a project, as a global tradition of this dialectical unity of theory and practice, and Marxism in fact names a project, a universal project, a project of universal human emancipation. Something to which Alan Badiou recently drew attention, making the point that no form of oppression can be reconciled with Marxism, if we want to take Marxism seriously, as a global tradition of this dialectical unity of theory and practice. So that's another thing, you know. Because I wrote an essay on Nazrul, and then somebody said, oh, you're trying to turn Nazrul into a communist. What the hell is going on? And so, well, I'm not trying to turn him into a communist, just citing some historical facts. He seriously contemplated building a communist party in India, as I already pointed out, of course, along with his friend, Comrade Muzaffar Ahmed. So he did that. And when he was writing his manifesto for the Labour Swaraj Party, which he founded, there too, you know, you'd find traces of the Communist Manifesto. So what did he do? Whether you want to call him communist or not is up to you, but I wanted to point out his connections, you know, to the Marxist tradition, the global Marxist tradition. It's not for nothing that he translated with utmost enthusiasm the communist anthem, the International. The International was translated by Nazrul, and there are several translations actually. And if you are interested, you can come to those translations are available online right now. You compare, I for one find Nazrul's translation is the most beautiful and most powerful. And Rabindranath Tagore also acknowledged that. Rabindranath Tagore and his comrades acknowledged that, and we continue to, many of us continue to acknowledge that. It's a wonderful rendition, wonderful translation. I would argue that Nazrul is indeed an exemplary, revolutionary humanist in the communist tradition, and in the indigenous one too, revolutionary humanist in the indigenous tradition that can be traced back to Chandidash, Nanok, and Lalan Fakir, the figures I already mentioned. Now second, Nazrul's reflections on what is called world literature remain largely unheeded, a point that I just quickly made. I want to take it up again. In a superb essay titled Bartaman Vishwa Sahitya, Nazrul astonishingly comes to articulate as early as the second decade of the 20th century his anti-Eurocentric internationalism that I argue can be effectively pressed into the service of decolonizing comparative literature today. Of course, there is a distinction. There is a distinction between internationalism and today's trendy, free-floating, ahistorical cosmopolitanism. Internationalism is profoundly political. It designates a committed and even a combative position that is acutely attentive and opposed to all forms and forces of oppression across the world. An internationalist in this sense, Nazrul comes to demystify, in his own way, the unequal exchange between the East and the West in the domain of literature as such, while valorizing the universal and emancipatory content of literary works themselves. I think we would do well to engage increasingly this Nazrul of world literature. I know, by the way, when I speak of universalism, still there are some Poco pomos. You know Poco pomos? Poco, post-colonialist and post-modernist and post-Marxist and post-structuralist and post-this and post-that. The Egyptian political economist and cultural critic Masoud Zabarzadeh used a fantastic term to describe it, post-all. So there are postal theorists or postalists. So postalists are generally suspicious of what is called universalism. And the universalism is amply vulnerable to their deconstructive projects. But as you have probably, some of you have noticed, is back on this agenda. Universalism is not something that is static. It's also historically constructed. And of course, there are different kinds of universalism. So the question is, what kind of universalism are we talking about? So there is that thing. Just wanted to, এটাকে বলে নোক্তা দেওয়া, একটা নোক্তা দিলাম. Third, Nazrul's creative multilingual interventions and first-rate WhatsApp translation that amply bespeak his literary internationalism have hitherto received very little attention. Nazrul knew at least 6 languages: English, Arabic, Persian, Hindi, Urdu, Sanskrit. The inaugurator of the ghazal form in Bangla poetry and music, Nazrul even ended up writing some ghazals in Urdu and some bhajans in Hindi. Nazrul had a profound love and knowledge of Persian poetry in particular. He was deeply drawn to such Persian poets as Sheikh Saadi, Hafiz, Rumi, Jami, and Omar Khayyam. But in my reckoning, no attempts can match up to Nazrul's beautiful translations of Omar Khayyam. Equally beautiful and even powerful are Nazrul's translations of not only Hafiz's ghazals, but also his rubaiyat, for which Hafiz is of course less known than Khayyam in our part of the world. Nazrul even ventured to translate into Bangla more than 30 Quranic verses. They appeared in his book called Kabbe Ambara, which appeared in the year 1931. And his translations of Surah Fatiha and Surah Ikhlas seem so beautiful and so accurate that, allow me to tell this, just my impression, are so accurate that Allah is not likely to be unhappy if one recites those surahs in Nazrul's Bangla during the prayers. I think we would amply benefit from undertaking a comprehensive study of Nazrul's works of translations. Fantastic translations. I just can resist sharing one rubai from Hafiz with you. Nazrul puts Nazrul, this is Nazrul. It's partly erotic, but the erotic is used as a metaphor for divine love. And that's the case with Hafiz. Buk hote tar biran khole, shamandi oi tumni jokhon thik madhur, thik upama khuje, aine khuje, she madhuri dekhai kam. Emni torol, ruggo tahar, buker tole, hridoy dekhai, pukur tole, shudol nurijam. There's a 4-line poem, Rubaiyat, quatrain, Rubaiyat. Rubaiyat is in the singular, Rubaiyat in the plural. Now another area, fourth, not much attention has been paid to how Nazrul revolutionizes the field of metrical experiments by appropriating in his poetry, with unusual effects, as many as 18 different Arabic and Persian meters, among which particularly worth mentioning are Mutakarib, Muddarik, Hazaz, Razaz, and Mashakir. His poem called Dudul, composed in Mutakarib, is, I think, a metrical to other horse. A poem that seems to be anticipating even some of the textures and valences of what is called hip-hop and rap. Do you want to listen to Nazrul's rap?
Yes, sir. Yes.
All right, let's do this. It's called Dudul. I hope I have the copy of the poem here. Yes. Dudul, written in Arabic Mutakarib. বাংলায় করতে দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল বেনির বাদ আল্ক ছাদ খবর ফুল কানের দুল খবর ফুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল অলক ছায় কপল ছায় পরশ ছায় অলস চুল বিনুল বিন কেশের উল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল অসমৃদ্ধ কাকের পিঠ অসমৃদ্ধ পিঠের চুল লোহিত পিঠ ননদ দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল সোহাগ খায় দোলন গায় কাপন খায় আপন পায় পায়ের নখ মাথার চুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল পরাগা পাক ছড়ায় আর সিরাজবাগ ইরাম গুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দেবুল বুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল কাগন চায় নাচন পিন রিমিকিচিন আচল পিন চালির রিং বুলাই লিড ঢুলাই ঢুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল নিঃশ্বাস শেষ কাঁপাই বেশ মতির হাত হিয়ার দেশ কাঁপাই শেষ প্রাণের কুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল বুকের কোল আদর ঘায় দোলাই দোল সরম লোল মরম মূল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল কলস কাপ পুকুর চা আঁচল চা চুমাই ধুল দক্ষিণ হাত ঝুলন ঝুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল কাকাল খিন মরম ক্রিপ ভোলাই জ্বর ভোলাই ঝে গমন দোল অতুল তুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল হাসির ভাস ব্যথার শ্বাস চপল চোখ আখির লাশ নয়ন নীর অধর ফুল রাতুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল মৃণাল হাত নয়ন পাক গালের টোল চিবুক দল করাই ভুল প্রিয়ার মোর কোথায় তুল স্বরূপ তার অতুল তুল রাতুল তুল কোথায় তুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল দোদুল দুল। Islam's metrical experiment in Bengali poetry, written, as I pointed out, in the meter called Mutakarib, and also Muddarik and Razaz, Hazaz, Mashakir, and so on. Now this last area, again I'm returning to the question of the protocols of Eurocentric comparative literary criticism. As I've already pointed out, it is customary to compare Nazrul to Byron and Shelley and Whitman, but I think we would do well to explore both aesthetic and ideological connections between Nazrul and certain revolutionary poets from what Che Guevara himself called the tricontinent, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, in the very spirit of Nazrul's own critical stance vis-a-vis world literature. One may trace exciting and useful parallels between Nazrul and a whole host of poets from the Third World. Of course, the Caribbean poet Amos Césaire, the Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet, the Latin American poets Roque Dalton and Otto René Castillo, the Korean poet Kim Ji-ha, the Urdu poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, for instance. All of them were fiercely opposed to such systems of oppression, to put it bluntly, as capitalism, colonialism/imperialism, and racism, among others, and all of whom deeply believed in nothing short of revolutionary politics. To put it bluntly, to rediscover Nazrul in our times is not to depoliticize it, but to rediscover a revolutionary aesthetic and politics in the interest of the, I quote, the total emancipation of humanity, unquote, to use the African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral's phrase. And I want to share with you a Nazrulian poem by Faiz Ahmed Faiz, one of the greatest Urdu poets. He was a very politically engaged poet, a great love poet. In fact, there was a time when I used to use his love poems in my love letters. They were very favorite one of mine. Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and Faiz Ahmed Faiz as a poem is Nazrulian. And when Faiz Ahmed Faiz was here in Dhaka in the early 1970s, he actually inquired quite a bit about Nazrul Islam. He met Badruddin Omar here, and he met others too. Badruddin Omar, and it was Badruddin Omar, the author of this monumental work on Bhasha Andolan, told me this in a conversation. So he was deeply interested in Nazrul's work, and see the Nazrulian strain, Nazrulian strains in this poem I'm going to share with you. It's called Speak. I myself translated this into English. Speak. Your lips are free. Speak. It is your own tongue. Speak. It is your own body. Speak. Your life is still yours. See how in the blacksmith shop the flame burns wild, the iron glows red, the locks open their jaws, and every chain begins to break. Speak, speak, this brief hour is long enough before the death of body and tongue. Speak, because the truth is not dead yet. Speak, speak, whatever you must speak. So, the last stream, the concluding stream of my lecture, I think I need to return to this great poem called Bidruhi. It has been read and reread and overread and discussed in all kinds of ways. So I'm trying to offer a rereading of this great poem called Bidruhi, the Rebel, to see its aesthetic and political significance at this conjuncture. I take Bidruhi as a revolutionary signifying intervention on behalf of the toiling masses in particular. Nazrul's lines keep throbbing and pounding relentlessly like tidal waves in the space of the poem. In fact, the entire poem moves at a well-worn pace without losing its architectonic integrity, aesthetic beauty, and political vision. Nazrul seems to be taking to heart Marx's famous injunction to writers. I quote Marx here, the beautiful one line, Marx, rub your conceptual blocks together in such a way that they catch fire, unquote. And one notices the fire qualities, the fire-like, the fiery qualities of the poem, literally. Nazrul seems to be, he also rubs his conceptual blocks, his images, his tropes and tenors in his poem. The poem itself, I think, is a dialectical dance of the insurrectionary imagination of a poet in the high noon of British colonialism in India. An example of both literary and political rebellion, the poem unsettles an entire set of poetic and stylistic norms on the one hand, and militantly confronts the oppressor of humanity on the other. One hardly finds a work in Bangla literature that formally and politically and anticipates the Bidrohi, a poem that combines in unprecedented ways a variety of metrical patterns and lexical resources. True, in Bidrohi, Nazrul seeks to confront and combat oppression of all forms. True, Nazrul was even sent to prison for writing poetry that fiercely fights the oppressor. It is in this context also that one can place Nazrul in the company of some of those, within quotation marks, third world revolutionary poet activists I mentioned earlier: Hikmet, Dalton, Castillo, Faiz, Darwish, Kim Chiha, and Maria Sisson, who all had to go to jail or prison because of their activist poetry that continues to threaten and unsettle the powerful and the dominant, generally speaking. While Nazrul's poetry took him to prison, the language of his poetry ends up breaking the walls of that prison and even sets him free in a certain sense. Bidrohi dramatizes and mobilizes his accumulated resistance to the prison house of language. Given this resistance, then, one can also place Nazrul in the tradition of his predecessors I already mentioned, Chandidash, Nanok, and Laran Fakir, who all radically explore the power and limits of language while seeking to evolve a new one by advocating the freedom of humanity. Also, in terms of literary rebellion, one might compare Nazrul to Michael Madhusudhan Datta, who inaugurated a decisive rupture with the literary tradition preceding him. Yet Nazrul is strikingly different from Madhusudhan. Unlike him, Nazrul remains so firmly, even organically tied to his own people, poor peasants and workers. Thus, one can easily take Nazrul as an example of Gramsci's organic intellectual, who is different from a traditional intellectual. Like a true organic intellectual, then, Nazrul internalizes, articulates, and advances the cause of the oppressed, their aspirations, their nightmares and dreams, their struggles at more levels than one. As Nazrul maintains symptomatically in his poem Bidrohi, I quote, in poor translation, admittedly, "I am the pain and sorrow of all homeless sufferers. I am the anguish of the insulted," unquote. Surely, Bidrohi can be read as an exemplary anti-colonial text, the kind of text that is animated and energized by opposition and resistance to colonialism. One may certainly profitably compare Nazrul's Bidrohi to Yeats's poetry of decolonization, Amy César's anti-colonial poetry, Frantz Fanon's liberationist counter-narrative of anti-imperialist resistance, and works of other third-world writers that Edward Said catalogs and values in his work called Culture and Imperialism, José Martí, José Carlos Maria Tegué, W.B. Du Bois, and Amilcar Cabral, among others. This is the list that Edward Said himself provides in his book, Culture and Imperialism. In fact, in his Culture and Imperialism, Said theorizes the very culture of opposition and resistance at some length and maintains, and I quote Said, "One of the first tasks of the culture of resistance was to reclaim, rename, and re-inhabit the land. And with that came a whole set of further assertions, recoveries, and identifications, all of them quite literally grounded on this poetically projected base," unquote. That was Said. Bidrohi can certainly be read, I think, as a poem of assertions and identifications in the Saidian sense. Nazrul, as an act of identification and assertion, foregrounds, accentuates, enacts, repeats, and even renders ubiquitous the I, not this I, the I itself, not the I, and both in some ways, the I of the poet. The I is used more than 100 times. Also, he uses it with such force and fury that one gets the impression that Nazrul keeps exploding his verbal bombs one after another at the roots of colonialism, in fact, at all forms and forces of oppression. Thus, Bidrohi seems to be anticipating the spirit of one of the opening statements Frantz Fanon makes in The Wretched of the Earth, and I quote, "Decolonization is a violent phenomenon," unquote. And in his penchant for decolonization, then, Nazrul resorts to linguistic counter-violence in order to withstand and even be completely do away with colonial violence itself, in the very interest of building what Nazrul himself calls in the poem, I quote, new universe of joy and peace, unquote. But it is unfortunate that while Edward Said, in his Culture and Imperialism, particularly in his chapter called Resistance and Opposition, invokes a number of anti-colonial poets and writers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, he does not mention our Kazi Nazrul Islam at all. Said comments Rabindranath's progressive take vis-a-vis nationalism. Of course, I must point out here that Said is extremely and very, very limitedly, if you will, familiar with Rabindranath's own texts, just a few lectures on nationalism. So he was making assertions about Rabindranath Tagore on the basis of those lectures he read. Anyways, so Said comments Rabindranath's progressive take vis-a-vis the question of nationalism, while rather uncritically placing him side by side with the black theorist, writer, activist W.B. Du Bois. It's like, putting a liberal humanist and a very radical revolutionary theorist activist on the same plane, and they're not making any distinction. Bring them together. This is the kind of, I think, comparison sometimes does that. You bring together higgledy-piggledy, all kinds of figures, in ways in which you find it fun. It's very intellectually exciting. But what happens is, at least a form of what Frans Fanon, not Gayatri Sudhak, Frans Fanon was called epistemic violence. Well, understandably, there is Said assigns Nazrul a blank in his otherwise massive undertaking, and this blank probably has to do with Said's own lack of familiarity with Nazrul's work in English translation. It is unfortunate that Nazrul hasn't been translated much, into English, and there are some translations, with the exceptions of a few, translations. Most of them are not really very well. As far as I'm concerned, not even readable. So there is that. But one can surely argue that our rereading of Nazrul's work could have significantly contributed to the strength of Said's chapter on anti-colonial resistance and opposition. As a text of resistance and opposition, Bidruhi first identifies a series of contraries and then morphs them into an aesthetically and politically strategic unity of opposites against colonialism and communalism. That strategic unity is particularly signaled, and towards the end, bear with me, that strategic unity is particularly signaled and enacted by a movement from the I to the we, a movement that releases a radiant burst of a collective revolutionary subjectivity towards the end of the poem. Also, Nazrul's style of bringing together different and disparate elements is revealing and instructive. He yokes together certain elements of Hindu mythology with those of Islam. The ways in which Nazrul brings together those different and even apparently contradictory elements do not, however, attest to an unproblematically orchestrated unity of Islam and Hinduism as such, but they strategically point to the tensions and transactions between the two in response to what Frans Fanon calls the perverted logic of colonialism that is characteristically divisive. Also, at other levels, Nazrul's language offers a frequent interplay between the poetic and the prosaic, between the lyrical and the dramatic, between the indigenous and the foreign. Nazrul combines lexical resources drawn from Arabic and Persian and Bangla in ways in which he inaugurates some exciting relations of language in Bangla poetry itself. He chooses words and even localized idioms from rural Bangla, while using Sanskritized words on other registers. Indeed, Nazrul creates a language that is markedly different from that of Rabindranath Tagore on the one hand, and on the other from the language of Bangla literary modernism, represented differently by such poets as Jivanananda Das, Sudhin Datta, Amiya Chakraborty, Buddhadev Ghosh, and Vishnu Dev. Finally, Nazrul remains alive and relevant as long as his lines continue to resonate with the wretched of the earth, with the oppressed of the world. I quote Nazrul, "I, the great rebel, shall rest in quiet only when I find the sky and the air free of the groans of the wretched of the earth," unquote. It sounds like Nazrul's permanent revolution. He won't stop. It's still continuing. He's alive and it's continuing. Indeed, it is in the interest of our struggles against all forms and forces of oppression and injustice that we need to reread, remobilize, and even reinvent Kazi Nazrul Islam. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know, this is Thursday afternoon, and so many of us are here. So is it because of Dr. Azfar Hussain?